What then takes us to the place of where we can say such things as, well, if we forget some piece of luggage in our travels and we end up in some foreign realm, then is it not necessarily like being more awake and less into the dream if all creature comforts themselves separate us from things like animals in the scene? Well, how far can we go away from the night and the dream before we come into some state of being that is just like observing everything? But is that not the human being itself? The idea of the observation, the idea that we sit and look at things on a screen and we don't necessarily feel contemplation or frustration, it's just observation. So how strong is the night if that is itself daylight? Is the animal itself like a state, not necessarily something that goes around in some frustrated mode to try to find food and to try to find shelter underground? All these different animals, it seems pretty fairly wild, if you ask me, that all they do is find one type of food and they hibernate behind the scenes. If we say then that all life relates to some conscious thing, then this conscious thing doesn't necessarily exist for the degradation and the denaturization of things. It exists because it exists, and it doesn't necessarily need necessity, you see. So, what are animals then to you, to me? If these things have some sense of there being a greater thing that observes something and says to itself, well, sure, they do that, but what is their reason for existing? Isn't necessarily that. Well, how long is the night before we forget daylight? And we say to ourselves that if that is daylight, then these things exist as some grand metaphor, just as opening and closing the door. If they don't necessarily exist out of fear, they exist for the idea that daylight is near.